introduction.
Hey guys, Great Big Bore. The Quran project is going a bit more slowly than the Bible project went, mostly because I grew up with the Bible and therefore already knew a lot about it. In order to do justice to the Quran, I need to do quite a bit of research. I'm working on that, not to mention doing some research for a video that will make amends for appealing too much to emotion when condemning punishment-based ethics. Unfortunately, the fact that I'm doing research doesn't mean that I'm going to shut up. Having done only a little digging, I'm finding interesting related topics to discuss. This is part 1A of my multi-part essay, God Needs a Quality Control Department. Outspoken skeptics are often criticized for mocking the beliefs of the religious, belittling that which is held sacred, blaspheming their supernatural being or beings. What the religious never seem to realize is that their own apologists treat their beliefs, their sacred items and activities, and their god or gods with far more contempt than any irreligious person ever could. Consider all the religious people who, speaking publicly on behalf of their God, lie, dissemble, ignore the facts, present appallingly faulty and inconsistent reasoning in support of their arguments, and when shown to be flatly and utterly incorrect, abandon reason altogether and claim that the irreligious will never understand because we lack spiritual discernment, or because we have not felt the power of God in our hearts, or the most childish non-argument I've ever heard, because we just want to go on sinning. Here I'll review a debate between a Jesusianismist and a Mohammedanismist concerning which of the two religions' mutually incompatible doctrines of salvation is true. On the side of Jesus is Dr. William Lane Craig, a prominent Jesusianismist apologist who, in spite of having multiple graduate degrees and at least 2 PhDs, is a fellow of both the Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture and the International Society for Complexity, Information, and Design. If that's not a clear sign that getting degrees in theology is a complete waste of time, I don't know what is. On the side of Muhammad is Shabir Ali, president of the Islamic Information and Dawah Center International in Toronto, who also has a few useless religion-oriented degrees. Throughout the debate, both speakers make various assertions of fact without providing any sort of support at all, apparently assuming that the entire audience simply agrees with them. As I will show, some of these statements are just too preposterous to be accepted without some sort of defense. Also, both speakers make numerous egregious mistakes of reasoning that go absolutely unchallenged by anyone. These unsupported assertions and flawed arguments cannot stand, and any claims based on them must be rejected pending better support. Dr. Craig begins the debate with his opening statements, saying,
Muslims and Christians agree that God is the greatest conceivable being. If there were anything that you could conceive of that were greater than God, then that would be God. So God has to be the greatest conceivable being.
Where does this notion come from? Is it based on knowledge, observation, experiment? No. It's an assertion based on nothing. Some may say that it's based on centuries of theological investigation. Exactly, just as I said, it's based on nothing. How can theology be considered viable when its students do more diverging than converging? This is how we know that science is right. When everyone performs the experiment the same way, they all get the same answer. But consider two hypothetical religious people. First, a Jesusianismist who seeks God with all his heart, fasting, praying, humbling himself, sincerely and confidently believing that he has a rich personal relationship with the supreme being of the universe, and concludes that Jesusianism is the way of salvation. Second, a Mohammedanismist who seeks God with all his heart, fasting, praying, humbling himself, sincerely and confidently believing that he has a rich personal relationship with the supreme being of the universe, and concludes that Mohammedanism is the way of salvation. The fact that there are millions of such Jesusianismists and millions of such Mohammedanismists proves one of two things. Either all religion is utter bullshit, demonstrated by the fact that sincere students of it do not generally converge on the most important concepts, or Yahweh is real and it intends to throw at least one of these sets of millions of people who seek it with all their hearts, fasting, praying, humbling themselves, sincerely and confidently believing that they have a rich personal relationship with it, into everlasting torment. My best guess is that Yahweh, if it is real, intends to throw all of us into hell, given that it has, deliberately, because Yahweh doesn't make mistakes, made its message of salvation impossible to decipher even for those who work desperately to understand it. That's the end of Part 1A. Thanks for watching. This is God Needs a Quality Control Department, Part 1B, in which I continue my discussion of the debate between William Lane Craig and Shabir Ali held at York University in Toronto on March 5, 2002. The focus of the debate is this question: which doctrine of salvation is correct, that of Jesus-Ismistism or that of Muhammadanismistism? It seems to be allowed by no one that both doctrines could be incorrect. In this video, I conclude my comments on Dr. Craig's opening statements. After having embarrassed himself with the baseless claim that God is the greatest conceivable being, Dr. Craig continues.
Now, besides being all-powerful, all-knowing, and so forth, the greatest conceivable being must also be all-loving, morally perfect. God must be a loving and gracious being, for it's obviously morally better to be loving rather than unloving.
I'll grant you, with no argument whatsoever, that it is morally better to be loving than to be unloving. I'll even grant your assertion that your claim is obvious, with only a bit of a raised eyebrow. Not because I find it non-obvious, but because this is just sloppy debating. Support your claims. You spend an awful lot of time unnecessarily quoting the Bible. You could have used that time explaining the philosophical and ethical foundation of your claim. Still, to avoid getting bogged down, I'll grant you this one. What I can't grant is that it is equally obvious that it is morally better for hell to exist than for it not to exist, or morally better for mostly decent people who reject this disgusting God to burn for eternity than for them not to burn for eternity, or morally better to drown, immolate, starve, and put to the sword countless innocent babies, toddlers, preteens, teenagers, young men, young women, mothers, fathers, grandmothers, and grandfathers than not to do so. If we can rely on what's obviously morally better, then Dr. Craig has handily proved either that his God doesn't exist or that it is incalculably evil. Dr. Craig continues.
What would you think of a parent who said to his children, if you measure up to my standards and do as I say, then I will love you? Some of you have had parents like that who didn't give you unconditional love, and you know the emotional scars you bear as a result.
The good doctor is repeating the mistake he made in my last point, making a statement that when applied consistently rules out any possibility of his God being good. What would you think of a parent who said to his kids, if you don't buy my fire insurance, I'll torture you brutally while keeping you alive for continued torture for as long as possible? We would think that such a parent was evil incarnate, I would expect, or at the very least psychotic, not fit to be a parent, and in need of treatment. Another point made by Dr. Craig.
If he were to allow some evil to go unpunished, he would not be absolutely just. Every sin must receive its just due. Otherwise, God's justice would be compromised, and he would not be absolutely holy.
According to the evangelists Matthew and Mark, Jesus himself said, with God all things are possible. All things, except apparently blinking at sin. Was Jesus merely speaking metaphorically here? If he was, then what other things are not possible even with God? Dr. Craig seriously undermines the credibility of the Bible as a life instruction manual if we can't even take Jesus' factual assertions as such, as though the Bible needed any help in undermining its own credibility. The final point of Dr. Craig's opening statements that I would like to address.
The Muslim doctrine of salvation makes salvation virtually unattainable.
Dr. Craig is implying that the impossibility of receiving salvation means that that particular doctrine of salvation must be invalid. Applying this principle consistently, I find that the Jesus-Ismist doctrine of salvation makes salvation by just being a decent person actually unobtainable. Therefore, by Dr. Craig's own argument, the Jesus-Ismist doctrine of salvation cannot be valid. That's Part 2B. Thanks for watching. This is God Needs a Quality Control Department, Part 1C, which is Part 3 of my thoughts on the debate between William Lane Craig and Shabir Ali, held at York University in Toronto on March 5, 2002. The focus of the debate is this question: which doctrine of salvation is correct, that of Jesus-Ismistism or that of Mohammedanismistism? In this video, I address Shabir Ali's opening statements.
So God's plan then is to extend His mercy to humankind. But Surah 7, verse number 156 warns us that that mercy will be given to those people who fear God, who pay the charity, and in basic terms, who try to be good.
Good according to what standard? The Mohammedanismist standard, where it's okay to beat your wife, to own slaves, to amputate limbs as a punishment for crimes, to kill people for abandoning the faith, to lie for the purpose of advancing the faith, to cut off the clitorises of little girls. And, by the way, if anyone wants to drop the old chestnut about how that's not required by Mohammedanismistism, but is instead a cultural tradition, that's not my point at all. My point is this: if Allah calls for adulterers to be stoned to death, then why does it remain utterly silent on the subject of horribly mutilating little girls? Or maybe you mean good according to those who treat their wives and children well, who are honest and open, who speak up for the rights of the oppressed. No thanks. I'd rather not spend eternity with that God. It's contemptible. In Dr. Craig's opening statements, he rattled off numerous verses from the Quran that explicitly say that God does not love sinners. Here, Ali tries to address that point.
Or the Quran says that God does not love certain people. Muslim scholars take this to mean that God is trying in some way to reach out to these people who need threats, who need something harsh to be said to them to bring them back to the right path. On the other hand, we understand that in fact God in some way loves all human beings, and He wants to extend His mercy to all human beings.
So the Quran can be interpreted metaphorically. Does that perhaps mean that I can be saved by intoning "there is no God but no God" and Muhammad was epileptic? I somehow doubt it. Ali picks up a concept that Dr. Craig had introduced earlier and puts his own monstrous spin on it.
Even human parents do that sometimes. Sometimes we say, look, if you don't shape up, you're not my son.
This is only slightly more horrible than Dr. Craig's statement about bad parenting. What makes it more horrible is that Ali seems sincerely to believe that this is perfectly acceptable behavior. I've made this kind of point before. Go ask 100 qualified child mental health specialists whether this is effective parenting and conducive to the well-being of a child. I imagine that anyone watching this will concede that the vast majority of such a group would very strongly recommend against a parent ever saying anything like this to a child. If anyone seriously doubts this, please let me know on what grounds you doubt it. I don't know 100 therapists, but I do have a kid, and I know some of her friends, and I think I can easily identify those whose parents unload this sort of nastiness on them. Neither the kids nor the parents are emotionally healthy. Ali makes the point that it's quite easy to be saved according to the Quran.
The Quran, in fact, speaks about salvation in some very general terms as requiring almost just simply, in a nutshell, belief in God. For example, in Surah 41, in verse number 30, the Quran says, "As for those who say, my Lord is Allah alone, the angels," and they remain steadfast upon that, "then the angels would descend upon such persons and say to them, you shall have no fear nor grief coming upon you, but in fact have good news."
Funny, it seems that he is using the Muhammad Sarwar version of the Quran, the only one out of the 7 translations on the Quranic Arabic Corpus website that translates the Arabic this way. I've put the relevant link in the love bar. The Khan translation cops out entirely and just Latinizes the Arabic word and renders it stakamu. The other 5 translations tell a different story. The Sahih International version says we must remain on a right course. The Pickthall version tells us that afterward we must be upright. The Yusuf Ali version says we must stand straight and steadfast. The Shakir version says we must continue in the right way. The Arbery version says we must go straight. Ali, you called upon Mohammedanismist scholars for support in one of your earlier points. Would you call upon those scholars here? Would you get consensus that in this particular verse, Sarwar has best imparted Allah's true meaning in English, while 5 translations that agree with each other are incorrect? Or are you implying here that Allah would approve of an English-speaking Mohammedanismist getting 7 translations of the Quran and then picking and choosing the translation he finds the most to his liking for any given verse? That's part 1C. I know, I said 2B in the last one. I just like to confuse people sometimes, including myself. Thanks for watching. This is God Needs a Quality Control Department, Part 1D, which is Part 4 of my thoughts on the debate between William Lane Craig and Shabir Ali, held at York University in Toronto on March 5, 2002. The focus of the debate is this question: which doctrine of salvation is correct? That of Jesus-Ismistism or that of Mohammedanismistism? In this video, I address the beginning of Dr. Craig's first rebuttal to Ali.
If your doctrine of salvation is incompatible with the essential attributes of God, then it cannot be true, because it means that that God cannot exist and offer that plan of salvation, because they're logically incompatible.
What? A God that introduces logical incompatibilities is a God that does not exist? Let's have a brief look at some logical incompatibilities enumerated by Victor Stenger in his book, God, the Failed Hypothesis. I'll add some details for each one of these in the love bar for any philosophy geeks out there. 1. A supreme being, by definition, cannot be virtuous, as explained by Douglas Walton in his essay on cardinal virtues and divine attributes. 2. No being can be a fitting object of worship, as explained by James Rachels in his essay, God and Moral Autonomy. 3. The problem of evil, as discussed by Martin and Monnier in The Impossibility of God. 4. 3 points explained by Theodore Drange in his essay on incompatible properties. A perfect creator cannot exist, a transcendent being cannot be omnipresent, and a personal being cannot be non-physical. Lastly, the paradox of omnipotence, as explained by J. L. Cohen in his essay, The Paradox of Omnipotence Revisited. Note that these writers are competent philosophers, and as such, they use a definition of God that is rather different from that of Dr. Craig. Sure, he tries to talk about God as though he's a philosopher, saying stuff about how if you can conceive of something greater than God, then the thing you're thinking of is actually God, and the thing that is not as great is not God. But he's cheating when he talks like this. Dr. Craig is a Jesus-Ismist, meaning that he believes God to be a specific being with a name, Yahweh, an individual with whom Dr. Craig has a personal relationship. When philosophers talk about God, they're not talking about any particular God. I have to wonder how God feels about its followers whom it loves so deeply and with whom it can't wait to hang out non-stop for eternity when they refer to it in such cold terms.
The second condition of adequacy is that it must make salvation obtainable for a wide number of people. Otherwise, it's not really a doctrine of salvation at all, but simply a doctrine of condemnation.
I can't believe that Dr. Craig can say this with a straight face, considering that the vast, vast majority of all humans who ever existed will indeed be condemned. This point is made obvious by the fact that Yahweh's followers have split into literally thousands of sects with flatly contradictory doctrines. Consider as an obvious example Dr. Craig's religion versus Shabir Ali's religion. The number of such doctrines that can possibly be correct is less than or equal to 1, and my money is on less than. Also, what counts as a wide number of people? Jesus himself said in various places, such as Matthew chapter 22, verse 14, "Many are invited, but few are chosen." Will Dr. Craig claim that when Jesus says few, he actually means a wide number? The so-called good news of the entire New Testament is indeed, by Dr. Craig's measure, a doctrine of condemnation, not salvation.
And then he concludes, let us therefore ask God to make us deserving of his infinite love. You see, no Christian could ask God for that, because the Christian believes it's impossible to make yourself deserving of infinite love.
We'll all be a lot better off when we can get rid of hideous concepts such as deserve. But let's say we grant your claim that it is impossible to make oneself deserving of infinite love. How is it then that anyone can make oneself deserving of infinite torture? Actually, according to most Jesus-Ismists, it seems that we haven't made ourselves deserving of infinite torture, but rather Adam's one transgression in the garden made every one of us deserving. There's something really ugly here. Dr. Craig seems to be suggesting that we don't actually deserve the infinite torture, but that it comes to us through Adam, just as salvation comes through Christ. So, we'll be tortured forever, although we don't deserve it. It's a nice God you have there, Dr. Craig. That's part 1D. Thanks for watching. This is God Needs a Quality Control Department, Part 1E, which is Part 5 of my thoughts on the debate between William Lane Craig and Shabir Ali, held at York University in Toronto on March 5, 2002. The focus of the debate is this question: which doctrine of salvation is correct, that of Jesus-Ismistism or that of Mohammedanismistism? In this video, I continue to discuss Dr. Craig's first rebuttal to Ali. Before I start, I'd like to let everyone know that beginning now, I will publish the scripts that I use in making these videos, in case anyone has trouble understanding me. After growing up in Texas, I found that no one outside that state could comprehend a word I said. I visited a specialist to have my accent surgically removed. The operation went horribly wrong, as you can tell. I'll always put links to my scripts in the love bar. I have scripts for all my videos, but I don't feel like posting them all at once. If you'd like the script for any given video, send me a PM and I'll post it. Now to the debate. Ali, in his opening statements, had responded to Dr. Craig's point that the Quran drills it into our heads that God does not love sinners. Ali's response was of a type that I hear from a lot of Mohammedanismists. Our God is no worse than yours. To get this point across, Ali points out Psalm 5, verse 5, which he quotes as saying that God hates evildoers. Dr. Craig responds,
Second response I want to make is that these passages quoted by Shabir Ali about God's hate are found in the poetic books in the Old Testament. For example, in the Psalms. And everybody knows that you cannot base doctrine on poetic expressions.
This is probably the most egregious error in Dr. Craig's entire presentation. No, let's face it, the man has multiple degrees in theology and therefore knows better. This is what we in the atheist community call a lie. Funny that I've been told so often that atheists have no morals. Hold in your mind the statement that Dr. Craig is considering doctrine, the statement that God hates evildoers. Now consider these doctrinal points from the New Testament book known as Hebrews. From chapter 1, verses 1 through 14. Jesus is far superior to angels. This is more relevant than modern Jesus-Ismists may realize. My understanding, although I haven't done any serious research on the matter, is that the author was trying to put a stop to some angel worship that was going on at the time. Therefore, it is important doctrine, intended to inhibit idolatry. From chapter 2, verse 8, everything is subject to Jesus. From chapter 2, verse 11, Jesus calls his followers brothers. From chapter 3, verses 7 through 19, unbelievers will never enter God's rest. From chapter 4, verse 9, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. From chapter 5, verse 10, Jesus is designated by God to be the high priest for the saved. From chapter 7, verse 22, because of God's oath, Jesus has become the guarantee of a better covenant. From chapter 10, verses 9 and 10, God has set aside the old covenant and replaced it with the new one. Everybody knows that you can't take doctrine from poetic passages, you say. Obviously, the author of Hebrews didn't know it. Every one of these points of doctrine, some of them clearly foundational to the entire structure of Jesus-Ismistism, is based on verses from the Psalms, and Dr. Craig knows it. In fact, in the book of Hebrews, I count some 39 references to verses in the Old Testament. 17 of those references are from the Psalms and 2 are from Proverbs. That means just under half of the Old Testament foundation for some of the most important doctrine in the book of Hebrews comes from poetic passages. Shame on you for lying, Dr. Craig. For anyone who's interested, I've put some details in the love bar concerning which psalms are used by the author of Hebrews.
So that his love is conditional, it is partial, it is selective, it has to be earned. And that, I think, is morally reprehensible.
You think it's morally reprehensible. Wow, so we get to interpret the Bible based on our own morality? Human morality is qualified to pass judgment on religious claims? That's great. I have quite a few moral objections to the Bible myself. Too many to mention here. Check out all my Bible series if you're interested. An easy summary of all my videos would go like this. Yahweh itself, I think, is morally reprehensible. Do I win the debate? That's part 1E. Thanks for watching. This is God Needs a Quality Control Department, Part 1F, which is Part 6 of my thoughts on the debate between William Lane Craig and Shabir Ali, held at York University in Toronto on March 5, 2002. The focus of the debate is this question: which doctrine of salvation is correct, that of Jesusianism or that of Mohammedanism? In this video, I conclude my discussion of Dr. Craig's first rebuttal and move on to Ali's first rebuttal. Ali, in his opening statements, had alluded to the Mohammedanismist belief that the Apostle Paul was an evil heretic who invented Jesusianism. He suggests that Jesus and Muhammad were in far more agreement than Jesus and Paul. As an aside, I have to agree with him here. I noticed a zillion times while working on my New Testament videos that Jesus' philosophy is very much like Muhammad's. Dr. Craig responds to Ali.
And finally, Shabir charges that Paul originates this doctrine. And that's simply false. Those verses I quoted in my opening speech were largely not from Paul. They were from the book of Hebrews, which was written by a Jewish Christian.
Wow, this guy is brazen. He has already told a big fat lie about how you can't derive doctrine from the poetic passages, rendering the book of Hebrews utterly worthless. Obviously, he thinks he can get away with it. Obviously, he does get away with it. Why? Because the average Jesusianismist doesn't even know what he believes in the first place, much less what the Bible tells him to believe. But even if we pretend that Dr. Craig did not tell this lie, that he does in fact have some respect for the book of Hebrews, he's spouting nonsense anyway. The Apostle Paul himself was also Jewish. Is Dr. Craig trying to say that the fact that this author was Jewish but not Paul suggests that the author was more likely a member of one of the non-Pauline camps? I can't figure out why Dr. Craig would even bring this up, except employing his polished debating skills to draw attention away from the fact that his entire argument is bullshit, that he doesn't even believe in any God, but makes all these public appearances for the money. Moving on to Ali's first rebuttal. Ali, with no comment whatsoever, completely abandons his earlier claim that all of the Quranic verses saying that God hates sinners were figurative. He switches over to this idea instead.
In the Quran, in Surah 2, God says, Inna Allaha bin nasi la ra'ufur rahim. Surely God is tender and loving to all humankind. Now that's a general statement. If there are certain statements that say that God does not love certain persons, then that is the more specific statement that falls under the general umbrella. So God's eternal attribute is still there, that He is loving, He is kind, He is merciful.
Wait a second. What kind of debate is this? You present an argument that you're willing to concede with no comment at all? Doesn't that suggest that you knew in the first place that the point was worthless, and you were just hoping that Dr. Craig, or at least your audience, would let it slide? This is a contemptible way to debate, and it really dishonors the God that you claim to be glorifying.
Even Christians believe that God will send some of His enemies, if you like, into hell, where they will dwell in that fire for eternity. Are you saying that God loves these people in the same way that He loves those whom He will put in paradise?
This is perhaps the only good point made by either speaker in the entire debate. This is something that has bothered me about Jesusianism for a long time. God, quote, loves everyone, but treats some unspeakably badly. How can that be called love? What is love if it allows for that? Is love that includes that kind of treatment a good thing? There is a serious cognitive dissonance associated with this God. At least Mohammedanism is honest. God hates certain people, and will punish those whom it hates. That's Part 1F. Thanks for watching. This is God Needs a Quality Control Department, Part 1G, which is Part 7 of my thoughts on the debate between William Lane Craig and Shabir Ali, held at York University in Toronto on March 5, 2002. The focus of the debate is this question: which doctrine of salvation is correct, that of Jesusianism or that of Mohammedanism? In this video, I'll conclude my musings on the rebuttals and finish with some thoughts on Dr. Craig's closing comments. Ali, either because he doesn't know the Bible very well, or perhaps because he and his opponent had previously collaborated on a plan to minimize the effort necessary to fleece their audience, has this to say about Dr. Craig's assertion that one can't base doctrine on poetic passages.
Now, Dr. Craig says, all right, these psalms are poetic expressions, so they must be understood as poetic expressions. Certainly there's a certain degree of exaggeration in poetic expressions, and we understand that. But what do you think that the Quran is? The Quran is a very poetic book. And although it says certain things there, we should not always take it literally. But
Get this. He started with the idea that the Quran is to be interpreted figuratively when it says that Allah hates sinners. When Dr. Craig pushed back a little, Ali abandoned that idea and tried to say that Allah is loving in general, so it's okay for Allah to hate specific persons. In other words, admitting that it's literally true that Allah hates sinners. Now that Dr. Craig has claimed the right to interpret Psalm 5 verse 5 figuratively, Ali feels more confident about his original point and goes back to it, giving up on his second point. Ali is clearly demonstrating here that nothing he says has any merit on its own. Rather, for him, the debate is about saying whatever you can get away with and giving your half-asleep audience the impression that you have something meaningful. The discussion has degenerated from a question of whether this God is good to a question of which debater has enough charisma to convince you of his interpretation of Holy Writ. Further, what is it with Mohammedanismism that encourages this childishness? He starts his argument with, hey, my God is not any worse than yours is. Now he has moved on to, dude, if you can say it's poetry, then so can I. I fully expected Ali to say something like, I know you are, but what am I? Some people object to me referring to Ali's religion as Mohammedanismism, and I'd love to change it to Pee-wee Hermanistism, but then no one would know what I'm talking about. Moving on to Dr. Craig's second rebuttal, Dr. Craig addresses Ali's earlier statement that God is loving and merciful.
In his own words, not just in those of the Quran, tonight wants to tell us that God is loving and merciful. But the question is, what does this mean?
Okay, I can agree with what Dr. Craig is doing here, but I want to apply this question to the claim that God loves us all. What does this mean, given that a very tiny percentage of us will escape eternal torment? This is a strange kind of love, at least at the same level of strangeness that Dr. Craig is imputing to the so-called love of Allah. Dr. Craig begins his closing statements.
I want to shift gears in my closing statement and share a little bit about what salvation means to me personally.
I met this fantastic woman years ago. Like an idiot, I worshipped her from afar for 2 years rather than asking her out. Let me tell you what she meant to me personally. Dr. Craig presents his first encounter with Jesus while talking to a fanatical classmate in high school.
And she said, because he loves you, Bill. And that just hit me like a ton of bricks. And that thought just staggered me. Worm down there on that speck of dust called planet Earth. And that ignited a fire in me.
One day, I finally got up the nerve and asked this woman out. We got on well. The first time we had sex, I was astonished. To tell the truth, I was astonished pretty much every time. The thought that she found me attractive was staggering. She was an amazing woman, and I was, am, a doofus. Dr. Craig describes the moment of his conversion.
I felt this tremendous infusion of joy, like a balloon being blown up until it was ready to burst. And that moment changed my whole life.
Oh yeah, there was a lot of blowing and bursting in those days, but it got even better. After a while, she told me that she loved me. I started to like myself for the first time in my life. I started to feel like maybe I wasn't ugly and stupid after all. I couldn't be, or this fabulous woman who could choose anyone she wanted wouldn't love me. My life took on meaning, purpose, direction, because of her love. That was a long time ago, and I've grown up a bit. My point here is that it makes no sense at all to attempt to connect the validity of one's interpretation of an experience to the weight of the experience. Sure, it was profound. That's great. But how can you possibly get from there to the claim that it was God causing you to have that experience? You can't, any more than I can say that God was causing mine. All you can say is that you discovered something profound, which happens a lot to young people. Some may wish to object that Dr. Craig's experience was due to God, while mine was due to a human. I'd like to know how anyone could possibly tell the difference. Further, you could easily find thousands, probably even millions of people in the world who have had similar ecstasies but have attributed them to Allah, or Vishnu, or Apollo, or the tree spirit down by the fishing hole. Using the depth of your experience as an indicator of the truth of your religious belief is preposterous. God, if you're out there, I strongly recommend that you institute a quality assurance department, because these bozos are making you look really bad. That's part 1G, the end of my comments on this debate. Thanks for watching.